Hi, everybody, and welcome. It's Friday, so it must be Connetics USA weekly show, onwards and upwards, everything that a healthcare worker needs to know about coming to live and work in the United States. I am your host, Tanya Friedman, CEO of Connetics USA, part of the AMN Healthcare family. Today's topic is immigration, and I can see the comments in the chat are already starting. Lots and lots of questions, lots of concerns, lots of things to ask the experts who we'll be bringing in shortly. But if you are interested in coming to the United States, please apply now to the Connetics USA website, and our team are on hand right now to help you to make your American dream a reality. Today is a very special show. We have a different format, and I am joined today by Danielle. Danielle Chasen is my daughter, I'm proud to say, everybody who's watching. And this special show is in honor of our anniversary of coming to the United States. We arrived in the United States 23 years ago on the 4th of July. I always thought that was a significant day, Independence Day. And Danielle is joining us today. She is living the American dream. She came here at the age of 8 years old. Danielle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Mom, and hi, everybody else. It's so nice to be here. I've been watching my mom do these shows for years now, and I'm extremely excited to finally be on the show co-hosting with her. Thank you for the introduction, Mom. A little bit about me. I am a lawyer. In my past life, I practiced at a big firm, and now I am at Connetics. I help out with a lot of our business development, a lot of our different projects. I help all of our different teams. So maybe you've seen me before if you work with the Connetics team. And I've been here for almost 2 years now, or a little over 2 years, actually. But very excited to finally be on the show with you, Mom. A special day.
Thank you, Danielle. Everybody joining us around the world. I see we have a lot of questions in the chat right now. Please put your questions in the chat. We are going to be bringing in our dynamic duo, the two experts, Chris and Mike, shortly. And there they are. Hi, Chris. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Tanya. Hey, Danielle.
Morning, everybody.
Morning, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about immigration. This is the open forum that everybody waits for every single month, and especially today because the dreaded word retrogression has become a hot topic right now. So we are bringing in our experts to find out more about that. We have a lot of topics that are going to be coming up on the show. Danielle will be helping me to co-host. So we're going to be talking about the visa bulletin. We're going to be talking about retrogression. We're going to be talking about the EB3 green card route, which is the Schedule A way that nurses come into the United States. We're going to be talking about the TN visa, which is the visa that Canadian or Mexican citizens can enter the US in. We're going to be talking about adjustment of status. This is a different kind of green card and what that's all about. We're also going to be talking about H1s for MedTechs. We have lots and lots of MedTechs, medical lab scientists who are coming into the United States on H1s. And we also are going to be speaking about student visas. So lots and lots of things to cover today. And I see we have a lot of people joining us in the chat. So Amber is saying hello. Suresh is saying hi. Tala is saying, has got a question. Philip, Ghana, Peniasi, welcome everybody. Please put into the chat what your name is and where you are from. We love to see our viewers all over the world. There are literally millions of people these days who are watching Onwards and Upwards. And before we get started, I just want to share a little bit of a personal story for those immigrants who are thinking about coming to the United States. So it was 23 years ago. I was in South Africa, which is beautiful South Africa, my home country. Danielle, at that time, who you see on the screen, was around 7 years old. And my husband, sorry, Dan?
You just aged me. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Sorry. And my younger daughter was around 3, and my husband was carjacked. South Africa is a beautiful country. It'll always have a very special place in my heart. But it was a very traumatic experience. There was a lot of crime in South Africa at that time, and I wanted to have a better life for my children and for my family. We came to America on the 4th of July, for those of you who've just joined us. So this show is in celebration of that milestone in our family. Danielle's was 8 when we arrived. My younger daughter was 4. And now that my family are living the American dream. So that is what we want for everybody who is watching today. As a mother, to look at your daughter and see her now living in the American world, and she's now a mother, and my granddaughter's is an American citizen. It's just a beautiful thing. So the experts here are here to pay it forward for you today, Chris and Mike, who are going to be sharing their expertise, and we are very grateful to them for giving us their time once a month so that they can pay it forward for those of you who want to make a better life for you and your family, as I did with mine. All right, so Amber is saying hi, Suresh is saying hi, Tala is asking, first question, how much time will it take to file in the DOL? Chris?
Yes, the DOL is the first step of the green card process. And the hospital or health system or employer in the United States has to file something called the prevailing wage determination, which is currently taking 7, 8, 9 months, unfortunately. A lot of health systems, though, already have that prevailing wage determination done, in which case we don't have to wait, because the prevailing wage determination does not mention the nurse. It mentions the employer and the fact that they are looking to hire a nurse in the United States. So so that's about it. It takes about 7 months, but ordinarily we have these prevailing wage determinations ongoing, and so that's not something the nurse needs to concern herself with.
Okay. And from the Connetics perspective, all employers that are hiring right now, we don't do a recruitment event until we've got the prevailing wage back from the Department of Labor.
Yep. So you don't have to worry about that step. We've already done it for you. I also saw a couple of questions, Mom. How do I get started on my application? There's a link in the chat. It's conneticsusa.com/apply. So our recruiters are waiting. They're going to reach out to you. please apply. We would love to help you.
Thank you, Danielle. All right. So, Mike, the hot topic right now is retrogression. Before we talk about retrogression, though, I want to maybe just take one step back and talk a little bit about the visa bulletin. This is a topic that is very confusing for a lot of the healthcare workers coming to the United States. Can you just give us a basic overview of the visa bulletin?
Sure. The Visa Bulletin is a publication that comes out monthly. It's issued by the Department of State, and it basically says for immigrant visas, or we refer to them always as green cards, as to what date they will process you through final completion. So for nurses who are overseas waiting for a consular interview, what date they will actually allow you to have your interview and then approve or stamp you in your passport and issue your immigrant visa. And these dates are broken up. The Visa Bulletin is broken up by categories, 1 through 5, and then there's something called an other worker category, and then by country. And you look at a column, and if your country is listed and you're, say, from the Philippines, you have your own column. If you're not from the Philippines, Mexico, India, or China, then you come under what we call rest of the world a category. And you simply look down and you find, so for example, the July bulletin that came out last week, the Philippines, EB3, which is the category where where nurses generally would be, is at February 1st, 2022. So that's the date. And let me explain how that date is significant. Everyone, when an I-140 is filed, if you're a registered nurse, if you're a MedTech or an OT or some other occupation, you get your priority date when your perm is filed, your first stage of the green card process. But for our end, you get a priority date when your I-140 is filed. Think of that priority date as your spot in the queue, your spot in the line. So if you filed your case today, June 16, 2023, that would be your spot in the line. And you need to be, coming back to the Visa Bulletin, you need to have a date earlier than the date on this bulletin in order to finally proceed with your case. So if your case was filed on January 1st, 2022, then you are what we all refer to as current, because January 1st, 2022 is your date. You look at the Visa Bulletin and you see it's February 1st, 2022, you know that you can move forward. If, however, your case was filed on February 15th, 2022, you are not current. So you're not at the front of the line. So your case will hold in the place it's at until such time as the date moves forward to get past your date, and then your case can move forward. The Visa Bulletin is available for free. It's public. You can sign up at the Department of State website to get it received. Chris's blog does a nice update on the Visa Bulletin every month when it comes out. I'm way behind Chris, so my blog is updated about a week after his. So I would look at his or the Department of State site to get the more current the more current bad news right now.
Okay, well then, Chris, you are leading the pack there. What can I say?
Well, hopefully Mike doesn't include the typos that are often in our blog posts. So.
Okay, well, it is. So we've got double trouble here. Okay, so I see there's a question from Emily who's saying, if the date doesn't become current in October, what date are we expected to be in for October? Also, would they make a category specifically for nurses like they did in 2005? So Chris, so let's move on to the retrogression, right? So Mike gave us a great, explanation of the Visa Bulletin. So maybe let's dig a little deeper into retrogression and look at Emily's question and give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so what Emily's question suggests, and I think it's an important fact for everybody who's listening, is that, here we are towards the middle of June, and the U.S. fiscal year will run until September 30th. So we have about 3.5 more months left. On October 1st, the new U.S. fiscal year comes in, which means that by U.S. law, 140,000 employment-based visas are then allowed. New visas are allowed to be allocated by the U.S. State Department. What we've seen over the last month or two is we saw a retrogression set in April, and then we've actually seen it, and that was June 1st, 2022 for Philippines and all other countries, basically every country other than India and China. And then it recently moved back a few more months. It's in February of 2022. What that likely suggests is that the U.S. State Department is expecting to use all 140,000 visas shortly. My guess would be in the next month or two, we will see it retrogress again. And or it might even, they might even put a U instead of a date. And that just simply means the category has fully been used and therefore the visas are unavailable, which is what the U stands for. My sense would be that will happen, maybe in the August or September visa bulletin. Again, it will either be unavailable or it will retrogress even further back. I wouldn't get too concerned about that because as we just mentioned, come October 1st, the new visas will open up. As to what date they will be, I mean, that's anyone's guess. Some of that's going to be driven by the amount of visas that are used here in June and July and maybe into August. I would expect it to be, no worse than June of 2022. I think it's probably going to be even a little more optimistic than that. But in terms of what date, anyone who suggests that they can even make an educated guess on that is just simply not being truthful. There's really no way to know that because no one really knows how many visas are stacked up at USCIS and State Department. But Tanya, I think this is the really important point. All of this, I think, is all interesting retrogression. It's in some ways frustrating, and I totally appreciate that. None of it really changes what anyone listening to this needs to do. The reality is, even if you filed your visa today, you're going to get your green card maybe in 18 months, something like that, maybe 20 months, maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter, because again, predicting the future is really a fool's errand to some point. But if you are interested in coming to the United States, and I can tell you from somebody who's been doing this for 25 years, almost as long as Mike, the numbers will be the numbers, and we will move through the system. We are not in a situation where it's going to retrogress through 4, 5, 6 years or anything like that. So there's no reason to worry about anything like that. In my mind, you want to control the things you can control, which is you can get your education straightened out. You can take the NCLEX. You can pass your English exams. You can apply for your visa screen. You can connect with a good recruiter like AMN Connetics so that you can come to the United States. And while, of course, we would all like it to be faster, whether it takes 12 months or 18 months or even 24 months, my experience is that actually isn't a lot of time is the reality over the course of one's career. And so I would suggest to you to not get too over fixated on retrogression and keep checking Twitter and updating your feed in order to see, did it come out? Is it this date or that date? Don't really worry about that because you can't control that. The part you can control are some of those things that we've talked about before. In terms of that second question, Tanya, do you want me to address that or about a separate category?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, so back in 2004 and 5, Mike and I and a few others worked with Congress to pass a law, and they did pass a law, and it allocated a chunk of visas, 50,000 visas, just for nurses, physical therapists, and their families. And that resulted in about 2 years or so worth of visas, and there was an actual category that was distinct for Schedule A workers, again, physical therapists and nurses. There has been an effort over the last 3 or 4 years to do that as well. There is, I can tell you, an effort going on within the industry now. We haven't been as public with our approach for a lot of reasons, but the main reason is the legislation isn't something that often benefits from big public pronouncements. But I can tell you, as someone who goes to Washington, D.C. regularly, There is some talk about that. I don't want to get into any predictions. I think all legislation is difficult in the United States. Immigration legislation is perhaps the most difficult. So no promises or anything that, but just because you are not perhaps hearing public pronouncements about it, that does not mean that there's not a steady, nearly daily effort. I am on the phone or contacting via email or text with folks in DC, several times a week. So this is an ongoing, consistent effort to try and create retrogression relief, really, for nurses and ideally other healthcare workers.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Chris. And I can also just share from the Connetics side that I was in South Dakota this week seeing one of our clients. We have, I don't even know, probably about 800 nurses with this client, and we're going to be recruiting about 700 more. So everybody apply online. There's an incredible community and a wonderful opportunity here. But the hospitals, the nursing homes, the rehab facilities are not slowing down by any means. In fact, they're speeding up. We are seeing more and more recruitment happening every single day from our clients across the United States in all the different states. And there is enormous efforts going on right now, as Chris has said. In fact, I think there was an article recently in the in Time magazine about all these efforts that are going on that are looking at how to carve out some healthcare visa relief for healthcare workers. So a lot of efforts going on in that regard.
I do think, just to reiterate, I love what Chris says. For a person who lives with a lot of anxiety about not being able to predict the future, control what you can control. Get started with your processing, take the NCLEX, apply, get your spot in line, get your priority date. I love that. Control what you can control. I think that's a good takeaway.
Okay, thank you, Danielle. So I think somebody said this on a previous show, the process remains the same. Nothing changes. It's just the timing that's a little delayed. All right, so let's move on now to Nadia. Nadia has a question. As a medical technologist going to the US through the H1 route, I understand that my dependent will not be able to work initially. At what point is my dependent able to work, Mike?
So your dependent H4 spouse can only work once you have an I-140 approved. And so once you come to the US on an H-1B, that's a temporary work visa. Your initial visa was probably valid for 3 years. At some point, your employer is going to initiate a green card case for you. The timing for them to initiate that is going to vary from an employer to employer. There's no law that says they have to do it by a certain time. There's no law that says they have to do it at all. But obviously, most employers are willing to do it. Some may wait 6 months, some may wait a year, some may wait 3 months. But let's pretend that your employer has initiated a case today. Unlike RNs, where, as Chris mentioned at the beginning of the call, and I think Danielle reiterated that you guys don't recruit until there's a PWD in place. With most hospital systems, MedTechs, they generally don't have PWDs in place. Now, some will, but most don't. So let's assume your facility does not have a PWD in place. They're going to do a prevailing wage request through the Department of Labor. It's going to take 7 to 9 months. They're then going to file the case with the Department of Labor. That's going to take about another 9 to 10 months. So we're at about somewhere between the 1.5 to 2 year mark to get through first stage, which is called PERM or labor certification. After that stage, then you can file the I-140. The I-140 can be done under premium processing for an additional filing fee of $2,500, and that can be processed in 3 weeks. So you get your PERM approved, you then do an I-140, then your spouse is eligible to file for their work card, and their EAD card is taking 4 to 6 months after that. So I would estimate 2.5 years is probably a decent estimate for your spouse to go to work. One of the other things to keep in mind, though, is that your H-4 spouse may have work visa options independently of you. And so those should be explored as to whether maybe do they qualify for an H-1 or some other work visa status. But if they're simply dependent upon you, 2.5 years is probably fairly reasonable.
Thank you, Mike. That's very interesting and very informative, especially with the timeline. I'm sure a lot of our nurses, I see a lot of questions about spouses being eligible to work on the H-1B visa. So I see another question in the chat I'd like to ask. I'm kind of curious. I know we can't really predict the future, but I am curious what happens when everything becomes current. So we have a question from Joyce. Joyce says, hi, Tanya. When the EB3 comes current in October, hopefully, will the visa interview be scheduled in the same month for those that have DQ before the retrogression? I guess Joyce's question is kind of what will happen? What's kind of the process for those who have been retrogressed? Mike or Chris, would either of you like to take this one? I'll open it up.
Okay, sure. I will say the bad news. I don't think all the dates are going to become current in October. So, sorry about that, but that's my opinion. I think the dates will move forward, but they're not going to all become current. If you are an individual who becomes current in October and you've already been DQ'd, then yes, you will be eligible to be scheduled for an interview. And the way those interviews are going to be done are going to vary by the consulate that you're at and whether or not they do interview notices like some consulates still do, whether they have a self-scheduling mechanism. And a lot of that probably is not yet determined by the consulates as to how they're going to handle that. Generally, things are done in order of DQ. And then priority dates, because the priority date has to be current in order to have that interview.
Well, you said something interesting there, Mike, and that was that you don't anticipate that everybody will become current. So that might be a little disappointing for some people who are hearing that prediction. And I just want to underline the word prediction because nobody 100% knows. So Mike, we're going to test you out in October and see how accurate that is. But I think that knowledge is power, everybody. So at least that sets the expectation and we have an idea. And that's where we're so grateful to our experts who are sharing their experience and their years of working in the space so that people can have an idea of what to expect. In a related question, Hillary is saying, does retrogression affect those who are on administrative process without a current priority date, Chris?
Yeah. So if you're not current, it doesn't really matter where you are in the process. The consulate or embassy is ineligible to issue a green card. So I wouldn't think of being an administrative process as any different than any other process other than this. You absolutely want to get that administrative process sorted. So for instance, if you are under administrative processing because, let's say, your visa screen had expired, then you need to make sure that you get your visa screen updated and valid and resubmitted to the embassy so that if and when you do become current, and you will become current, they are able to quickly schedule you and issue you the green card.
Okay, very interesting. A lot of good information for everybody. I mean, obviously we can't predict the future, but like, we said earlier, control what you can control. Get started with applying. I see there's a question. Oh, my chat just refreshed, but I saw there was a question about employers in the U.S. We have employers all over the U.S. So if you're interested in coming to the U.S. and you want to get started, apply at conneticsusa.com/apply. We have hospitals, long-term care facilities, every one of the 50 states. So if you want to get started, highly recommend you apply and get started on that process. I see an interesting question here I'd like to ask the group from Zohaib. Which route is best for MedTechs, EB3 or H1B? I know there's, probably a lot of pros and cons to both, but would love to hear somebody's opinion on that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think there's two things you have to look at and two decision makers in this as to which is best. And one is you have to look at the employer. What does the employer want? What's the employer's goal for this. And then secondly, you have to look at what's good for you and your family. And from an employer's perspective, if the employer is a nonprofit, cap-exempt employer, which means that they do not have to go through the H-1B lottery, they're going to be much, much more interested in doing an H-1B than, say, an employer who's not cap-exempt and has to go through the lottery. If you are already sitting here and you already have your visa screen in hand and your ASCP or license, depending on AMT, whatever the, I think it's ASCP would be the criteria, then, and you have a cap-exempt employer, they could theoretically have you here in the U.S. on an H-1B working in about 8 weeks. So that's pretty fast, and that may be their goal. For you as an individual, one of the things you have to think about, as we talked about earlier in a question about H-4 EADs and spouses not being able to work, if you have a spouse that needs to work when they come to the U.S., then doing the H-1 may not be the greatest option for you and your family, because your spouse may not be able to work for 2.5 years. But if you have a spouse who's not going to work, or maybe you're a smart person and don't even have a spouse, then the H-1 makes perfect sense, because you're going to be here in 8 weeks. So I think you've got to look at those two factors together: your employer's needs, what's the best employer for you, and then your personal needs. And then I think you just need to explain that to your recruiter, your case manager there at Connetics, to let them know, hey, here's what I would really prefer. Here's what I think works best for my family. And I'm sure they'll take all that into consideration.
So there really are their choices, is what we're saying. And it depends on your situation as well as the client that you are being sponsored by. And that's really a great option for a MedTech. And we have hundreds of MedTechs that are being placed right now through Connetics USA and through our sister company, O'Grady, Payton. There are many, many opportunities for MedTechs in the United States. So if you're a MedTech, if you've passed your ASCPI, please apply online, because we have a lot of opportunities for you. I saw there was a question that was kind of interesting, talking about is there a difference in the priority date for MedTechs and nurses? This question is from Paul. When does the priority date for MedTechs begin, as it is at the submission of the I-140 or at the labor certification? So I think, Chris, Paul is maybe getting a little bit confused about the H-1s and the green cards. I know Mike gave us kind of the overview, but you want to maybe kind of dig into Paul's question a little bit?
Yeah, no, sure. So the short answer, Paul, is that the priority date for a MedTech starts with the labor certification, which often is many months before the I-140. For the nurses, the priority date starts with the I-140. Now, if the analysis ended there, you would say, well, geez, why is it so much more favorable for the MedTechs? And actually, the reason is because nursing cases, we do not have to go through the PERM process. They go through a slightly different path called Schedule A. So we have both a PERM process for the MedTechs, and your priority date starts with the PERM filing. When the PERM process is finished, then a MedTech gets his or her I-140 filed, and then the last stage will be their consulate interview stage. Whereas with the nurse, they only do the second and third step in the process. The nurse's priority date starts with the filing of the I-140.
So I think we've talked about a lot of different options for how someone can come to the U.S. I see a question that I'm actually interested in. I hadn't thought of this one, but I guess if you're trying to hedge your bets, you might be thinking this. Mabel has a question. Can you apply for multiple visa types at the same time? For instance, a student visa and an EB3 visa at the same time. Can you do that?
Generally, no. There are some exceptions depending on the type of visa, but to answer their specific question, an F1 or a student visa is what is referred to as a non-immigrant intent visa. You are saying, I want to come to the U.S., I want to go to school, and when my schooling is over, I intend to return back home to whatever country I'm from, and that's where I'm going to live and work. And that's the representation you're making to the consulate in order to obtain the visa. However, when you file for a green card, an EB3 green card, you're making the representation that I want to live in the U.S. permanently. So those are inconsistent with each other. So if you've already filed an I-140 EB3 green card, your F1 visa would never be granted. Now, there's probably some rare exceptions to that, but generally speaking, it would not be granted. There are some visas that have what are called dual intent. The H-1B is one of them. There are also visas such as TN visas and E3s that do not have specific dual intent, but for all practical purposes have dual intent, where you can be on both a TN at the same time as you're being sponsored for a green card.
Okay, and I see actually a related question to that. Can you switch? What if your intent changes? What if you're on a TN visa, or if you have a pending green card application? John wants to know, can you switch to a TN visa? So can your intent switch once you're through the process?
So Danielle, I think the shortest answer here is when you get into this level of nuance with your case, you probably shouldn't be getting your legal advice through a forum like this. You should be contacting with the attorney to talk specifically about your case. As Mike just suggested, there's so much nuance to whether it's a student visa or a TN visa or an H-1 visa. Are you filing for a green card? If you are, what stage in the process are you? The reality is it can go in many different directions, and to generalize isn't really doing anyone any benefit. And so if you have that kind of situation where you have a TN or an F1 and you're thinking about a green card, you should absolutely be talking to an attorney who's going to specifically talk about your particular case, especially when you start even layering in more complex facts like, do you have a spouse? When do they work? It would be too general to try and answer that in this kind of a form.
Very good advice. Very good advice, Chris. I see we have some questions, changing gears, about licenses. Pratigia is asking about the Maryland and do they accept the PTE, and I see there was also a question from Nitu about the Canadian license. These are licensing questions rather than immigration, and our Connetics have an entire license endorsement team, an operations team, and they are going to be in the chat and answer some of those questions that are not necessarily related to immigration. I mean, they related to immigration, but they're not specifically immigration questions, because we want to make sure that we cover as many of your burning questions as possible, but we also want to ensure that we take the time of Mike and Chris into account and really pick their brains on the immigration side. I just want to take one question that's not immigration before we move to the next immigration question, and that is from Annie. Annie is saying, I'm Annie from Zambia. My question is, why don't you recruit nurses working in the primary healthcare facilities? All I see are adverts for nurses working in hospitals with a specified number of beds. So Annie, the good news for you, because I know we've been talking about a lot of the hurdles, hoops and hurdles. The good news for you is that Connetics USA is a direct hire agency. And what that means for you is that we have employers, different employers all over the United States that offer different opportunities. We have some employers that will only look at nurses who are working in an acute care hospital setting. But we have many employers across the United States that will look at nurses who are working in primary care facilities, working in skilled nursing, working in home care, working in rehab, lots of different settings, even if you have a gap in employment. We do have employers that will consider your experience. Danielle, I think there's so many other immigration questions. You want to go ahead and pick one from the chat?
Sure. As I'm scrolling through the chat, though, I just want to say it's amazing. I see Nanu from Finland. We had Annie from Zambia. I see Ken from Kenya, Mark from the Philippines. It's amazing to see our global community that joins us for this show every Friday. So excited to be a part of it and just love seeing all of these questions and everybody saying hello. So drop a hello. Maybe I'll share your name. Okay, let's see. What question shall we ask? So I see it's a pretty general question. It's a good one. Mark says, is it applicable for a USRN, the H-1B visa? So I know we've talked a lot about MedTechs and the H-1B visa. Is it possible for a registered nurse to come on the H-1B visa?
Generally, no. but there are some exceptions. The H-1B visa requires a BSN, and for most international RNs, they have a BSN, so they meet that standard. However, that BSN criteria goes not just to the RN or the beneficiary, but also to the position. And in all 50 states in the US, a BSN is not required for licensure. An associate's or diploma is sufficient. And for the large majority of employers in the US, a BSN is not required as well, which means that you may qualify, but the job doesn't qualify. So the general answer is no. There are some exceptions. There are some hospital facilities where a BSN is mandatory, and there are certain positions where a BSN is required, but not very many. So the short answer is generally no.
Yeah. And I think from our side, I mean, we've been doing this for many, many years, as Mike and Chris, and there are so few hospitals that will meet that requirement. But the good news is that we have some. So if that is something of interest to you, then please apply online and our team will help you with that opportunity. We have a question from Donna, who's asking if priority date is 2004. My goodness, Donna, you've been waiting for a long time to come to the United States. We need to get you here. How many months or years to wait to get a visa, Chris? So if somebody had a previous priority date that far ahead, how long do you estimate it would take for Donna to get to the United States?
Yeah. So, I mean, the reality is if the hospital or health system or staffing company has a prevailing wage determination that's current, we can go ahead and file your I-140 tomorrow, probably get it approved in 15 or so days, maybe July 1st. And then you would be scheduled for an embassy appointment, really, no matter what your nationality is, if you have a, nearly 20-year-old priority date. One thing to keep in mind, we're going to have to prove that priority date is still out there. So you're going to need documents. Sometimes we do help nurses track down those documents with a Freedom of Information Act request with the U.S. government. Candidly, something that's that old, it may be hard to do that. But if we can prove that you still have a 2004 priority date, yeah, you could probably be in the United States maybe by the end of this year, certainly early next year.
So Donna, you need to get on that. We need to get to the United States. That is a very long time to been waiting in this process. And we know it takes a long time, but it's time to make your American dream a reality. Right, Danielle?
Donna, yeah, and some good news for Donna. That's, I mean, she's been waiting a long time, but now might be the time. I see a question in the chat that I think, switching gears a little bit, I'm sure a lot of our nurses are curious. So Kay Mendoza asks, for nurses under EB3, does immigration mandate certain fees be paid by sponsor? So I know for a lot of our nurses, they're curious, what am I going to get when I move to the US? So with Connetics, you're coming as direct hire. So that means you're going to be the employee of that hospital. You're going to be earning the same salary as a US nurse with the same level of skill and education. And you're also going to be getting what we call a nurse package. So that's going to be all of the stuff that the hospital is going to offer you to defray your cost of moving, which is probably going to include your legal and government fees. But is there anything that immigration mandates that they pay for these fees? Mike or Chris?
It's a little more complicated in the Schedule A RN context, because what the government mandates is in the green card context overall, that the employer pay the portion that relates to the Department of Labor. So in a MedTech context, that's very easy. They have to pay for the advertisements. The employer has to pay for the entire cost of the perm process. Since there is no perm process in the Schedule A context, it's a little harder. However, there is a prevailing wage request, and there is a internal posting or union notification that's done. And those are technically Department of Labor processes. So you could make the argument that there is a small amount that is required to be paid by the employer by regulation, but it would be a fairly small amount.
So I think the point is really that they are, they're doing their parts. They're paying for that kind of beginning of the process, that prevailing wage process. But there's nothing in terms of mandatory fees. But the hospitals are offering nurse packages where they actually do generously cover those fees. And most of our employers actually pay what's called premium processing. So that means for your I-140 approval, you're going to get a determination back much quicker than you would if they weren't paying premium processing. So that's another benefit that you have if you come with a Connetics employer. So again, no mandatory fees per se, I guess we could say, but they do offer a lot of items in your nurse package, which you'll find out about when you interview and you go through that whole process.
Yeah, the employers right now are offering great packages. There is a lot of opportunity for nurses. There's a lot of appetite for nurses to come to the United States. There's a big nursing shortage, as everybody knows. So it's a good time still, even with the retrogression, to apply. Chris, Janet has a question. Can an NCLEX passer nurse who has H4 dependent visa apply for an EB3? So
yes, very much so, and we generally encourage it. And I think Mike was saying this a little earlier in the session. So if you're listening to this later, you might want to rewind a little bit. In order for the nurse's spouse, the H4 holder, to get work authorization, the nurse herself, and for that matter, the spouse themselves, need to be into the green card process. And by doing the green card process, it will allow the spouse to get work authorization. So yes, and it's very common for our H-1B workers in all sorts of professions, including healthcare, to have an H-1B visa and at the same time a green card going on in the background.
And I think that really is also helpful, because then we've got two people that are earning income, and that gives a lot of financial stability to the family.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see another question here from Evangeline. She's asking, can EB3 visa holder study other disciplines outside of nursing during days off? I think broadly, I've seen a couple of questions about this. While you're waiting for your processing, can you be doing other things on your day off, whether that's studying or working a different job? Chris or Mike, would either of you like to take that one?
Sure. For someone who's waiting overseas, I assume there's absolutely nothing that's prohibited on your days off. You can do whatever you want to do. If you're a EB3 visa holder and you've already entered the U.S. and you're working and you're asking the question about, can I do something else? The answer is yes. You're a green card holder. You're a permanent resident. You can study anything you want to on your days off. The hospital, I've never heard of any employment contract in anywhere, anyone have rules that would dictate what you can or cannot study. So I think you're fine.
You can't take another job, though, if you're on an H-1B. That would be one thing.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point, Chris. So Evangeline, there's a lot of opportunity there for you. We have so many questions in the chat, and I'm just looking at my desk. I've got so many questions here on my desk as well. I want to bring up, this is an interesting question because I haven't heard this one before. I have a question here from Carlos. Carlos is saying, I'm filed as a nurse aide, and I understand that there is a portion of the process where my employer has to advertise. What happens if Americans apply to their ads as nurse aides? Will that cancel my application? That's a very interesting, specific question that we haven't come across before. Mike, you want to take that question?
Sure. Generally, for positions like nurse aide positions and other positions that are being recruited for, the question isn't whether qualified U.S. applicants apply for the job. It's whether more U.S. applicants apply for the job than the hospital or system has openings. So generally speaking, the only reason a hospital or system will recruit and sponsor nurse aides is if they have a difficult time filling their spots. They may have 80 openings at any one given time. And so the fact that they have 10 qualified U.S. applicants that apply for the position will not impact your case whatsoever because they still have more openings than the 10 that apply. And what the hospital will do in that situation is simply make offers to those 10 that are qualified. And that will affect your case, no effect on your case whatsoever. Very common scenario, actually.
Well, that's good news for Carla. So no need to worry, Carla. Scratch that off your worry list. Danielle, what questions next?
Okay, so I see a lot of people from India in the chat. Hello to everybody from India. I see a lot of questions for Indian nationals. Valeri wants to know, can Indian nurses who have passed the NCLEX and the English exam apply? And maybe Valeri wants to know a little bit about what the situation is for Indian nurses. Chris, you want to take that one?
So can they apply? Of course they can apply. My personal experience is, unfortunately, no health systems in the United States really are willing to file for Indian EB3 nurses. And that's not because of any questions about an Indian nurse's abilities or capabilities or skills. It's really a reflection of the fact that there is a 10 plus year retrogression for India EB3. But I want to put two, and it was a nurse, right, Danielle, the question?
Yep. It was a nurse.
There are at least two things to think about. One, in some instances, in fact, we had Tanya asked a question a little while ago. If the nurse has a priority date that is, from 2012 or so or earlier, then the hospital, I think, might consider recruiting you. And so if you have a priority date from that old, you should submit your application into AMN. So that's one thing to keep in mind. A second thing to keep in mind is, and Tanya and Mike talked about this a little earlier, there are some hospitals in the United States who do require a bachelor's degree. And so if you're an Indian nurse with a bachelor's degree, they're rare, but they are out there. You may want to see if you can find a hospital that requires a BSN for either a unit or for the system at large or the hospital at large, because if so, you can get an H-1B visa and come into the United States. Once you're in the United States, that hospital can file your green card. It will unfortunately take 10, 11, 12 years under current processing times, which is obviously terrible. That's the bad news. The good news is you'll be in the United States and can keep extending that H-1B year after year until the green card is issued.
Well, we'll take any good news. So there are some options and some opportunities for Indian nurses, Chris, and that's really good news. Mike, we have a question here from Bongi, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who's asking about the EB2 visa. Tell us what the EB2 visa is and if that is a visa that's suitable for nurses or for MedTechs.
The EB2 category is based upon having at least a master's degree or master's equivalency. So in the healthcare space, the EB2 category is generally used for PTs, OTs, pharmacists, physicians. Those are the most common that use the EB2 category. Generally, RNs and MedTechs would not fall under the EB2 category. Some nurse educator type positions or nurse, the ones that do special IT nurse work might, but generally speaking, they would not fall. MedTechs or RNs would not fall under EB2.
Okay, so that clarifies Bongui's question. Danielle, I'm looking at the time. We are almost at time. I think let's maybe ask two more questions before we wrap up.
Okay, I think there's one topic we haven't touched upon too much, just talking about the OPT and F1. I think one question a little bit earlier, we talked about it. But maybe, Chris, if you want to give just a little background on what the OPT F1 option is. I see Emily has a question. What are the options for students on OPT F1 if we don't become current in October? When your OPT ends, would you have to change status or go home? Will the change of that be impacted by an approved I-140?
Yeah, so there's a lot to this because it'll come down to what your priority date is. We'll want to take a look at what's the likelihood of your case becoming current. So, this is one that I think you'll really want to talk to an attorney about to get specific answers in a general sense, though. But if your OPT period is over, that's it. Your OPT period is over, and therefore you have to get another F1 visa, perhaps, which is maybe re-enrolling in school or in another school. Perhaps you can shift to some other visa category. I don't know. Maybe you're a spouse. Maybe you have other talents that might allow you to get, for instance, an H-1B visa. Depending on where your green card is, that might be an option. And in some instances, you may have to go home. So there's a whole slew of potential answers there. And I definitely recommend that you get that taken care of, looked at very specific to your situation.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important point, Chris, and that is there are sometimes instances where there are most oftentimes instances where you have to consult a lawyer one-on-one with your case and your specifics. So, don't think that you can, find these questions on a forum. That the information that Chris and Mike are sharing with us so graciously is general information. Specific information to your case, you would need to consult with an attorney. There's a question from Mary John. Is there any chance of passing any legislation to reduce the backlog in the near future? Now, Chris, I know you touched on this in the beginning of the show, but there was an article that came out recently in the press, I think it was at the beginning of June, talking about, and I think we have a graphic of that article. Can you maybe talk a little bit about this article specifically? Because those of you who haven't seen it yet might want to have a look at it and find out more about it. Chris?
Yeah, this is a Time magazine, which, for a long time in the United States has been one of the premier news outlets in the United States. In the last maybe 10 years or so in the internet age, that's probably slowed down in its prestige. Having said that, it's still very well recognized publication. It was co-authored. It was an opinion piece co-authored by Kathleen Sebelius and Alex Azar, who were the United States Health and Human Services secretaries, both under Republican and Democratic administrations. And they jointly co-authored an article. And the idea of the article said that there is a massive nursing shortage looming here in the United States currently and expected to get much worse. And so they listed several suggestions they had. And most prominently, they noted increasing quotas for overseas nurses to come in and work in the United States. So that was a very positive piece of press. I know it's getting discussed in Washington, D.C. I've actually had some reporters call me to want to discuss the article for articles they're working on. So it is one good example of the idea that there is work being done to try and create a more favorable retrogression environment for overseas nurses. Having said that, it's not a law or anything. It was merely an opinion piece. But I think it's a very positive sign, and it's credible because we see, we're seeing folks talk about this.
Thank you, Chris. So I thought that was a really nice way for us to kind of finish off, because immigration is, and I know this personally, as I said at the beginning of the show, I was an immigrant myself, came here 23 years ago, and can be, and Danielle, my daughter, for those of you who joined the show late. So, it's such a frustrating process. It takes so long. There are obstacles, there are roadblocks, but it can be successful, and there is hope that that there might be legislation change. There is hope for many of you with your questions in the chat. I'm so sorry we weren't able to get to everybody's question today because there is a lot of frustration right now about retrogression. The good news is the process continues. There is enormous need for healthcare workers in the United States. More and more employers are coming on board. They are looking for you. So please make sure to get your NCLEX done if you are a registered nurse, your ASCPI, if you're a MedTech, and our team are waiting on hand to help you with making your American dream a reality, like I did with my family. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you to Chris and Mike, the dynamic duo who come on once a month, and we are so grateful for your expertise. Thank you for paying it forward for others and sharing your expertise, your knowledge, and your experience with those healthcare workers around the world that are confused, frustrated, inspired by this show and get a lot of information. I would also like to encourage everybody to go to the Connetics USA website, because with Chris, Mike, and Mike's help, we have some guidebooks that have been put together by Connetics. In fact, Danielle, as the Director of Special Projects, was actually the leader of those projects. And we have guidebooks on the EB3 green card process, on the TN process, on the adjustment of status process. So there is a lot of information to share on the Connetics USA website if you have specific questions about those processes. Every week we have Onwards and Upwards, and so some upcoming shows that you can watch. On the 23rd, we have American Babies. So I didn't have my children in America, but I've got my grandchild that Danielle has bestowed on our family, my beautiful grandchild. So we're going to be talking about American Babies coming up on the 23rd. Stateside, we are doing Southern living. What is it like to live in any of the Southern states? On the 7th of July, Mike and Chris will be back for our immigration Q&A. On the 14th, we have a very interesting show. What is the difference between direct hire versus staffing model, and how does that impact healthcare workers? On the 21st, Connetics Showcase on Arizona. So we are looking at what it's like to live and work in Arizona specifically. On the 28th, we'll have equality, diversity, and inclusion. And on the 11th of July, once a month, we have the LaFora Talk Show. In fact, Kay Mendoza wrote in a question, and we love Kay and Anna and all of the LaFora admin who also give so much of their time to their fellow countrymen. And on the 11th of July, we were working alongside preceptors. This is a great show because this is really on the clinical perspective, how to get the most out of your process. Also, don't forget, on a Monday, we have the Connetics College with our amazing partners, Aspire, Swoosh, iPass, and Niners, who do an awesome job of giving free information and free education on the NCLEX, on the English exams, all the different English exams that the CGFNS and Joseph Sildney now accept. And last but not least, the Connetics initiatives. So don't forget also that all Connetics healthcare workers get a free English scholarship. We have the $1,000 referral fee extended until the 31st of August. Listen to our podcast, Nursing in America, Nurse Aid Program, our weekly show Onwards and Upwards, Connetics College, and we also have many, many allied needs that are available. So I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank you to my daughter, Danielle. This was a special show for me at the anniversary of our arrival in the United States 23 years ago. And as I said earlier, this is my way of paying it forward for each and every one of you around the world who want to come and live here and have a better life for you and your family, like I did for mine. And Danielle, I feel so proud to have you on the show today. It really is very, very special.
Thanks for having me join.
And we're going to be putting up a graphic of some of our new arrivals in the United States, and to think about and ponder and look at these happy faces of nurses who are arriving, healthcare workers who are arriving in the United States. We have many nurses arriving every single week. So we'll leave you with that beautiful picture, and join us next week, everybody. Onwards and Upwards. Thank you. Bye.